right, we've been hanging around Europe in the 1920s, and we are going to spend a little time in Paris now as we explore deco, but we're going to bounce around a couple of places just like we did before. And we are going to transition because when last we picked up, we were talking about Rene Magritte, and we were talking about how Magritte made his living when he was trying to break into the painting racket by doing graphics for commercial purposes. And so, as you noted, those were deco, or as we will note, if you're not familiar with the style, we'll definitely get familiar with that. But more important than that, we're going to learn how things evolved, how we're going to start out doing a little flashback to our friends Beardsley in England and Bradley in the United States, the Nouveau movement, and we have another example of that, the Beggerstaff brothers, who we mentioned before, but they're going to come more into play now. And the Beggerstaff brothers, well, they were brothers-in-law, so close enough, right? And they were happening in the 1890s with basically the precursor to the Picasso movement, which we are going to get into first before we get into deco, because that still pretty much sets the stage here. And so what we've got after that is, once we cover Picasso, we will be moving directly to deco because that is the natural evolution, and here's why. Okay, we start out with the word itself. Picasso is placard, and it's also known, not in the Meg's book, but it's also known as Sash, which is object poster, okay? And the idea here is it's reductive, flat color design. Basically, this is a school coming out of Germany early in the 20th century. And what we have is, what we're dealing with is a new technology, the images, boldness, the playfulness or artfulness, if you will, of the letter forms that you see in the advertisements. In this case, the matches, you can read in Meg's the story about how this came to be. This is really the first example of what later became known as the Picasso movement. But we're talking about designers who wanted their work to be read easily for passersby. Just simplified shapes with objects, vibrant colors, bold, and a straightforward message for people on the go, where the composition is focused on the central object. Okay, and where it all started was with Lucian Bernard, self-taught German. When we get to Germany, when we get back to Germany for the Bauhaus, and we're talking about less is more, then it's really got its roots in here. Again, the flat background colors, eye-catching highlights, large, simple images, product names, bold letterings. This was the advertising of the day, okay? And its consideration was taken into the color. If you're using flat colors, use them purposefully. In the case of the Stiller shoes, you see the intense kind of a reddish orange inside the shoe, and that projects a very powerful message with very minimal information. This was happening in advertising for the first time. And then the Priester matches, that's the poster contest that he entered. He was working on deadlines. And the story goes, when he was first coming up with his advertisement, that he had the kitchen sink thrown in there. It was everything, including dancing girls, ashtray, cigar, tablecloth on a table, and just he luckily had an art director sensibility friend who said, too busy, too busy. So he just kept taking out these elements one by one. Et voila, we have Picasso. Okay, we're going to have to clip that out. Okay, focusing on Lucian, we've got the guy who came up with what was called Picasso. right? And you go and you check out the Meg's book, and they will tell you about how Christian Bernhard, self-taught artist, German, was working on, he decided he was going to enter a poster contest. He was not a professional, but he was going to give it a try. And he was working on a deadline. Everything was part of the original conception. He had dancing girls in the ad. There was an ashtray with a cigar smoking in it and tablecloth on a table. And luckily, he had a friend who had forward thinking thoughts about art directing and said, too busy, too busy. So one by one, the elements were eliminated, and then you wind up with three color basic shape. Less is more, which is the slogan that the Bauhaus is going to adapt in Germany. But there's the basics of plakat still. Flat background colors, eye-catching highlights, large simple images, the product names, the bold lettering. That's about it, okay? You still have very purposeful shapes going on there. You also have the purposeful use of these flat colors. Inside the Stiller shoe is this intense red, and the heel itself is a bright orange. So it's really using these three colors to pop and project a powerful message with minimal information, pretty much setting the standard. And here are a couple of others, variations you can see for the Adler Typewriter Company. And, compare that with back in the old Nouveau days when you just had all sorts of information in there. You had very realistic rendering of the product, and you had going back to our good friend Muka, we had so much stuff in any kind of advertising. It's like, this pretty much gives you an idea of what kind of size the typewriter would be if Muka was designing this poster, right? So you can think of Muka as the anti. And one other one that we're going to talk about, another guy, Ludwig Holbein, who was, along with Bernhardt, the leading plakat still designer in the years before World War One. And he took great delight in reducing his images to flat shapes. He was dealing with people now, okay? And you can see this kind of fadeaway look. You can see that just enough information is given to suggest the driver is dressed up, but the colors and the patterns are flat, as with the stripes, as with the checks on the left side and the rest of it. So that kind of minimalism was happening, and it was a development from what Lucian was doing. And one of the tricky things about in the history of design is that Ludwig Holbein was also working for Adolf Hitler. Adolf was one of his clients, and it was basically, yeah, okay, Ludwig, you're doing great, selling beer, right? But we really want you to go and start creating recruitment posters. I'm signed up to fight for the Third Reich. And here you have this basically, practically, literally bullet-headed soldier going on. And it's like, for quite a while, Holbein was not included in the discussion about graphic design history, because how dare you go when you glorify a Nazi like that? Well, the fact of the matter is that, yes, he was working for abhorrent clients, but then again, he was doing incredible work. He was doing great at what he did. Okay, you can see the power in this sort of thing. And he eventually got in, and there was some justification. It was a discussion going back and forth and saying, well, Holbein wasn't really showing atrocities. You can find plenty of those posters. He focused mostly on the positive aspects of the Third Reich, right? Instead of concentrating on anti-Jewish and war propaganda like other artists of the era, he was just presenting the Germanic soldiers as heroes. And so basically, there was little by little, Holbein got into the history books. Now, should he? How should he be handled in the history books? We've already talked about fascists when we were hitting on the futurists, but you know what? I'd like to hear what you think. And okay, got still finish up. Move on to Art Deco by way of checking out what came before. Speaking of Czech, we have the style Mucha, Le Style Moderne, that we already talked about, because as you remember, Mucha didn't like modern. He was doing timeless work. And so it was happening all in Le Belle Époque, right? The beautiful era, which was basically describing the glittering late 19th century Paris. And so, which, lasted, you could say from the 1870s to 1914, basically when World War was starting. But before that, it was a time of optimism, peace, prosperity, new technology, countless scientific discovery, and the arts, they were flourishing. We covered this a little bit already, and with all the masterpieces of literature, music, theater, and visual art that were evolving at the time. Okay, so this is a review of that. And so then we move on to something else that we could have talked about with time, and you can find it in the Megs, is the Nouveau was also happening in Scotland with the Glasgow Four, okay, who were basically Margaret and Frances MacDonald, sisters, and Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who married Margaret, and Herbert McNair, who married Frances. So this was the Glasgow School. And when you talk about Glasgow School, Glasgow Four, basically it was called Glasgow because of the school, and it was really just the four of them that were really doing it. But they were setting the stage, okay? They were getting more into geometry, and they were very important in the sense that they were transitioning. They were the transitions to the aesthetics of the 20th century. As Meggs has it, the crossroads between the decorative Art Nouveau and the modernism that emphasized rationality. And so there you have that type of school, which, as you look at it, something else was happening. It was in terms of being kind of dark. It was the Glasgow School was also called the Ghoul School, the spooky school. And it was an epithet, pretty derisive. And it was, they were distorting human form, right? But that's what needed to happen in order to make progress, in order to have the Austrian Vienna secessionists come along. In 1897, they were starting up. Basically, they were seceding from the Viennese Creative Artists Association. And basically, it was a rejection of the bourgeois art that was going on at the time. And basically, also, the heart of the conflict was a clash between the tradition of the times and the new ideas that were emanating from France and England and Germany. That's what was getting the secessionists cited. And they drew inspiration from the Glasgow School. You can see side by side. And you can see also that the geometry is coming into play and starting to animate the space in, say, Roller's work with the patterning, the mathematical patterns of squares and rectangles that Ullman Moser was using, which, we're creating the contrast. Look at the letter forms. Look at the capital R, that sort of geometry that's going on. And that is the next step into deco. because deco is all about geometry in one way or another. And when we talk about deco, we're painting a wide swath. But, there's definitely secession playing a crucial role there. And okay, we've been battering around the term deco, but it wasn't called deco. Well, in 1925, it was, here we see a catalog for decorative sculpture, arts décoratif. But up until 1960s, it was post-cubist pictorial modernism, right? It was a term that the British art historian Bevis Hilliard came up with and made to signify major aesthetic sensibility that was happening not just in graphics, but in architecture, product design, and defining it as taking place during the decades between the two world wars, basically from the Roaring Twenties through the Depression. So here we have another labeled art movement. And you can take a look at how, as I say, it applied to all sorts of two-dimensional and three-dimensional works. It was happening all over America and Europe. And, just getting away from the whole decorative, ornamental, curvy, asymmetrical forms and going to a sleek, streamlined look, linear, symmetrical. This was really the Industrial Revolution's maturity that was a big factor here. In the Nouveau days, they were still, the Industrial Revolution was still in its relative infancy, but we're talking about factories, we're talking about mechanics. And so, all that organic, fluid, asymmetrical work just wasn't really fitting in the new world that was coming in with the linear, streamlined works. Repetition, part of that whole assembly line aesthetic, symmetry, and various motifs, sunbursts, zigzags, and deco's also recognized for its use of modern materials like chrome, wood inlays, stainless steel, that sort of thing. And in New York, you can check it out with the Chrysler Building inside and out. There are the elevators. And you can also see the Gothic roots. I did a little collage there with an old cathedral, but you can see how it fits in its way, right? And here in LA, there are all sorts of things, all sorts of buildings we could point to. We all know the Citadel, but that started out as the Sampson Tire Works in 1930. And this was a kind of deco that would incorporate all sorts of effects from all over the place: Egyptian, Aztec, Assyrian motifs. You can keep getting glimpses of it as you get stuck in the 5 traffic, right? And more locally, downtown, if anybody has seen the Oviatt building, it is one of the masterpieces of Art Deco, and it's kept very well preserved since 1928, okay? And it has been reincarnated as the Cicada Club, and it's now this wonderful nightclub that's open to the public. Oh, here we have J.C. Leyendecker, an American artist who you can also look into if you're revolving around deco, because there's definitely tie-in with plakat still. You can see a little old whiny stuff going on there. And that particular image was taken whole hog by the Cicada Club. And it's just this marvelous place that really keeps those interwar years deco feeling, the whole glamour of it, just so in style. And when you go there and it's like a swing dance venue, people get dressed up. It's like you can see that there's a dress code at the Cicada. And it can get expensive for dinner, but oftentimes if you just go there for a show, live performances, basically what you're hearing is music from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. You're hearing the big band era. And it's wonderful. It's one of the major places that I am intensely missing. But if you haven't checked it out, you certainly should, even if it's just to take a peek in there. And so, as I was saying, deco is taking from everywhere, pretty much, all sorts of places. You can even go back to pre-Nouveau and see the influence. And okay, we'll get to, there's student work. Student handed this in. This is one of those things that could have been good, but it was still basic. And if you go and you read what this student submitted, you can kind of gauge exactly how much reading was happening here. Not that much, because it's pretty much laying out information. Here is these generalities. It's a time of rising cosmetic beauty industry, and makeup was important, and features were emphasized, and facial expressions. But when it comes to content, content for the sake of context, it's not really saying much of anything. So again, when you do these things, maybe think of doing a comparison and thinking, why does the design of the 20s and 30s differ from, say, the 40s and 50s? And the reason I use Dadam is because that's where we're going to get to another submission by another student who really did the research. Another good job here. And so what we find out about Dadam is from this student, it was the first magazine in German history that catered towards the interests of the modern women of the time period, okay? And the magazine itself consisted of illustrations, essays, photography, and journals that highlighted the new women of the time. This is important, the new women. We're going to be talking about flappers, but new women took all sorts of incarnations here. This complete independence from the whole Victorian era is finally complete here. Women have really become self-sufficient to the point where they're holding their own. And this magazine was creating an outlet for the promotion of women's achievements, their interests, career possibilities, okay? A magazine that wouldn't have existed. The very thought of women having careers. And so this is a part of the time. This is the part of history. And one of the most acknowledged aspects of the magazine was the way in which it challenged gender roles, okay? Because, think about when World War I occurred, women were forced to step into the roles that were usually dominated by men. And these included factory positions, hospital work, farms. And by the way, I'm still reading from or taking my cues from the students' papers. And so once women found their voices within these positions, they weren't going to go back down and step back into domestic narrative that easily once the men returned from the war. And this was reflected in Dadam, specifically here in the art that she is focused on by a guy by the name of Ernst Deutsch Dryden, highly influential German artist during Plakatstill time period, and very well known, made his reputation pretty much at Dadam. And in the first photo, we have an art illustration for the cover that he created. And he actually intended to be breaking traditional gender roles in here by portraying a woman with more masculine features, such as short hair, suit-like outfits, a fancy sports car in the background of the image. And this time, women were carving a new reality for themselves, one that put them in positions of power and increased their sense of independence and earned respect. And then the writer went on to talk about the other issues that were going on with masculine representations of femininity. And again, just this person really this is easily the A plus ultra in the Art Deco submissions for the reading assignment. And so we move on to the second picture, where you can actually see the masthead of the Dom. Another cover that he created. This was the automobile number of the magazine, but this time it's symbolizing a woman in the center of a circle that's composed of fancy cars facing her direction. She has their attention. And this is again part of that empowerment. This is, kind of lustful in a mechanical sort of way, which is also a part of Deco. And it's also showcasing the switch from male-dominated society, the one that put women at more of the forefront of attention. And what a clever way to do it here. And the woman in the center of the cover, I'm reading again, is meant to represent Tamara de Lempicka, who was an iconic artist and glamour star and was the face of New Independent Woman because of the way she created a successful path for herself through her work as a painter, and specifically the way she depicted wealthy and nude women as a way to continue to enhance the positive narrative for women and their capabilities. Okay. And the reason that I'm spending time on this, in addition to this being a sterling paper that is really capturing the era in so many important historical ways, and also because there were three other people who each one of them sent in the same picture, and that's this one. And it's auto portrait, 1925, also known as Tamara in the Green Bugatti. And again, you look at the writing, and you compare it to the material I just read, and it's kind of a so what sort of thing. It's got, generalities. Once again, it's an example of that. And it's pretty much declarations rather than analysis. Okay. Yeah, the independence and liberation of 2020s women, feminine power, sensuality, wealth, inaccessibility, all that kind of stuff, nice words that without any kind of context don't really give you much substance, okay? And wraps up shown with her driving a Bugatti, even though she didn't actually own one herself. Okay, this is the extent of the submission, and to which, to everything, and especially to the last sentence, you just have to say, oh, and and it's the driver is sitting at the wheel of her car with these full red lips and sensuous eyes, and she's got her gloves on, and she's kind of helmeted like an aviator. That the garment looks curiously metallic. And it is a good choice in the sense that it's a perfect image of modernity. Vintage 1925, and really embodied the spirit of one of the spirits of Art Deco in other ways. And okay, so here we have another student who wrote well about this. Talked about her self-portrait was commissioned for the cover of a German fashion magazine. Name of the fashion magazine, Da Dame, what we've just been talking about. And so there is context, right? Okay, reason for a high fashion look. The magazine was selling this image of wealth and excess and independence, okay? And so, relating to Art Deco, it was time characterized by a desire to reject conservative traditions. It was a time when the Industrial Revolution had pretty much settled in, and you had capitalism, you had consumer hedonism, and there was a massive increase in accessing luxury goods, right? And as a result, art reflected this practically global shift in personal desire to acquire a relentlessly marketed, luxurious lifestyle. Okay, that again, I was reading. So, this is this is news we can use. This isn't just fluff, okay? And there are all sorts of other ways you could go. Number one, you could have actually included the cover of the magazine. Here it is used in context, right? So we talk about concepts and context here. We also talk about Tamara as being a free spirit in terms of being playful with notions of gender, right? This is another cover that she did for Dodon, very forward looking. And, another way could have been to go and pick up another cover that was also, at the time, it was also basically taking the same elements but giving a different message. So what's what's being done here? What's the contrast? Why is, she giving this kind of sensuous but still icy stare, and her hands firmly but luxuriously on the steering wheel, as compared to the other one where the woman has a worried look in her face as the hair blows back. The only reason she's driving, otherwise, it's a very still picture. And so one last look at this particular work is at the Cicada Club. Another bonus you can get from going there is seeing a reproduction of the work displayed prominently in that old Oviatt building. And just to kind of wrap up with Tamara, this one I wanted to talk about. So far as I can see, it hasn't happened here. But one of the things that somebody did not that long ago, well, I'm always changing copy to keep things interesting. Basically, this analyze the importance of your images to design history is just another way of saying what you all are doing now. But this one, it's like, as soon as I saw it, I went, oh no, not only did this person not spend any time reading, this person didn't spend any time researching. Okay, this is, for starters, this isn't Tamara. This is someone who basically painted a young lady after the painting. And, for me, when I saw this, I didn't know the artist, but it took me like 2 seconds to be able to come across and find the image source, where it was, so it's not only the original, it was also cropped even from where it was being taken from. So, this is a lesson that I hope doesn't ever occur again. But since we were talking about Tamara, I thought I'd show it today. And so, here's, this is probably one of her most famous paintings. And, you could see how she represents blowing wind and how she represents eroticism with the dress clinging to her body. And yes, she did do nudes, as one of the other students mentioned. And, this is basically, it's a portrait of a young girl in a green dress, or just girl in green dress. And, last thing on Tamara is another reason we know she's very important is Google did a doodle of her. So moving from Tamara to yesterday, back to 1935, and we're in Paris now, okay? And here we have the scenes. These are the sizes that the posters were. I mean, they were ground level billboards, right? And we're going to see that Nicholas ad by Cassandra momentarily. But we're going to briefly touch on another comparative person. Some of you are doing Cassandra for your designer. And so look into Paul Collin. He was also a set designer, which is why I thought this was a good photograph of him. And he was doing work that was very comparable to A.M. Cassandra. They were definitely contemporaries. And the interesting thing about him that I enjoyed was he was doing the kind of work that was being done back in the old Folies Bergère and Moulin Rouge days. And basically what he was doing was, you can put this side by side with any of the works by either Lautrec or Charest, and you can see how animated it becomes. This is post-futurism, right? This is being able to commercialize on fine art, being able to come up with multiple images that help represent different drawing techniques, different changes of scale, transparency, overlapping images, and angles, the vibrant colors from the Kochtel, very informal compositions, very energetic linear drawings that basically expresses joy. It's like, let's go to this place, right? We actually touched on Davorin a while back when we were talking about Cubism, I believe, or actually it was Futurism. So, take a look, all the stuff going on here. It's like, what's happening there? Well, you can go for cocktails because look at that dress. You can see the can, just like back in the days of Henri. And you can also be doing the Charleston, certainly one of the most iconic dances of the Art Deco era. And the woman here is a woman by the name of Josephine Baker. She was so famous in France that she didn't even need to be. No, she was so iconic. She had so stylized herself that you could recognize her in an instant. And she was a singer. There are albums out that you can get with her work, but she was a dancer. That was the big reason that got people in her audience, in the audience, the butts in the seats, as they say. But it was in France. It wasn't in America. She was an American, but she really was able to get herself big success in the 20s. She was in movies by going over to Paris, and there she was a star. Okay, and in fact, this is another poster that used her. And here's something that we can deal with. This is another topic of discussion that I definitely want to hear from you, but and how you think about, okay, in context, this was the accepted mode of representation. And we look at that, and there's no doubt that this is gross, ugly caricature that's going on here. And yet, think about the context. Look into that whole idea of context. Does that justify this kind of use? Here are several other works by Paul Collin. Does it justify that sort of thing? Here it is. Another one where, okay, Josephine gets named. And you can see she also gets naked. That was part of her performance, and that was why she had one of the reasons why she had a much easier time in dance in the climate of Parisian libertinism, you would say. And so think about that. It's a topic that I would have loved to have talked about in person, but we're doing what we can with what we can. And here's another something to throw into it all for you to discuss on our discussion board is, here's another deco, and it's by another artist, and it's a graphic designer, and it's teasing the whole idea of, okay, when does caricature become caricature? When is it flattering? The rest of it. So I'm not going to say anything about it because I want to hear your unbridled opinions, okay? So discuss. And with that, we come to the last person we're going to be talking about in Deco is Adolphe Moran, who rebranded himself A.M. Cassandra. And from 1923 to 1936, okay, he revitalized French advertising art, which had become somewhat moribund. It was like, okay, we've had enough. Nouveau, thank you. But he came up with a stunning series of posters. And I'm going to show you posters that I would have loved to have been able to talk about because they are travel posters, and Cassandra specialized in travel posters. But unfortunately, what we got was a submission by a student that talked about Art Deco and talked about these are travel posters, but in terms of actually talking about the images themselves, I mean, go back and check your instructions, because what you're supposed to be doing is talking about the images. And there were 5 images that would have been wonderful to have talked about if the research was done, okay? So moving on, so we'll go back to the days of Art Nouveau when you have work like this. And then, it started getting a little industrial revolutionary with this travel poster, more straightforward, with this wonderful advertisement for everybody to sign up to go on the maiden voyage of the SS Titanic, which, I mean, speaking of Deco, everybody can just go back and watch the Leonardo DiCaprio movie there. But okay, this was the early days, the preface of what was being done there. So what happens is, here we have Cassandra coming in and making a big splash. Yes, I did say that. I can't help myself. And, again, compare and contrast. 1907. Basically, here's the same picture, right? A steamship with smoke coming out and a small tugboaty sized boat next to it. You can't call that a ship. And, look at the contrast. Look at this, in real life, if this wasn't stylized, if it wasn't abstract, geometry, abstract. These are words that we need to talk about with Deco, okay? And we'll see why even more momentarily. But, look at the dynamic quality. It's like, the whole idea of this actually being a real steamship, a ponderous steamship, is thrown out the door. This was distorting scale where this ship is actually just this mammoth wall of steel that's towering over the tugboat. And you can see that by flattening the upper decks, again being abstract, it actually completes a solid rectangle, right? And, it's only this wreath of smoke that ties the two ships together and creates a softening effect, this kind of a little question mark sort of shape that links it. And moving on from there, 1934, we can see where Germany is taking it. As people start realizing they are warming up for some serious business happening here. And so, yeah, you look at these ships, the Normandy. That's one of his strongest. I mean, just in terms of even how the type is lining up. I mean, Antique is good. You take a look at these type fonts were designed by Cassandra. The letter forms, the typefaces, I should say, and take a look at that at the Q in Atlantique. I mean, we've come a long way, baby, from that Trajan sweep of a Q, right? You take a look at this, and it's practically the power button on a Macintosh, right? Geometry. And so there's the curves of the bow kind of come down. Again, these sensuous forms, these broad, simplified planes of colors. And the subject matter is basically being reduced to iconographic symbols, okay? And Cassandra had this special ability to integrate words and images into a total composition that was unique for its time. Oh, not exactly unique, but not a lot of people were doing it. Very concise statements. He was taking that Placage to the next level, to combining the telegraphic copy, powerful geometric forms, and symbolic imagery, and simplified the natural forms into almost pictographic silhouettes. Okay, these are his steamship posters, right? The contrast going on, and picking some odd shapes to focus on for the ships. I mean, the smokestack, with a funnel and a railing and a lifeboat for who thinks about, we think of it in context today. It's like, why are they showing a lifeboat? Is the memory of the Titanic still too fresh in the minds of people? And we want to think, okay, it's a giant steamship, but we got this keen little boat that we can get several people on. And so there's the deck, and the hull acts as a background for lettering. And the quote marks could even be small, for small portholes, right? And and look at the smoke coming out of there. This was way pre-ecology. It's like, this was still back when pollution was glamorous, right? And yeah, let's advertising with the other poster. Let's advertising the ship by showing the ventilation tunnels, right, in the foreground. So geometry and going to railway. Okay, fashioning the train's destination into a railway track. You can see, basically you're coming from various places, joining up in Berlin, and then separating again. So it's getting that message, it's getting more messages across in the border, and it's all about contrasting the light and dark and accentuating the straight lines, and this dynamic vanishing one point perspective going on. And those, by the way, on the right side, those are telegraph lines that are receding into the extreme lower right corner. And at the time, you could identify those instantaneously. They were that iconic. And we're going to come back to those in a moment. But just to go on, again, this was a time of speed. This was a time where what Cassandra was taking he was taking all of what we talked about, well, pretty much all of it in chapter 13, and making it work in graphic design, okay? So we are revisiting chapter 13 by our deco chapter, okay? You just take a look at this powerful propping that Cassandra has done here, that whole vertical and horizontal compression of energy. It's like, "Ugh, this is just ready to bust out." And you can constantly go back and see, the kinetic and dynamic aspects of a train in motion that Ferdinand Leger was doing with his machine art. Here we have, that was Cubism. Here we have Surrealism, this dark eeriness with electrique in bright light. The cropping, the very elegance of the simplicity, that futurist motion with the Pathé logo going around there. And another one here, watch the Fords go. He wasn't the first poster artist to be influenced by Leger, the futurist, and the rest of them, but he was the most forceful and the dynamic in his execution. And we just checked this out. So here what was happening 9 years earlier. Okay, here's what Cassandra saw when he took a trip to the museum, because they didn't have the internet back then to do image searches. And watch the Fords go. One of the reasons to watch the Fords go was that it was Bonnie and Clyde's car. And look at the geometry. It's like Cassandra's not using the literal Ford V8, right? Watch the Fords go here in Manhattan, where you can hardly move. And so what's going on here? What is that halo around? What is that radiation coming from this man? Well, that's something that was rendered in airbrush. That was a popular tool of the day. That's another reason that the tie-in with technology and history and design. And when we say airbrush, it's like, okay, airbrush. Yeah, I know airbrush. Airbrush is that thing that happened. That was an old version of Photoshop. But, this is an actual airbrush that I hunted down. This is from the actual date, 1925. So this was the kind of airbrush that Cassandra might have used. And just briefly, what it involved was that you would put the ink in the receptacle there, and you see that button on the top, you would actually be spraying the ink out of this device, because the airbrush was actually hooked up to a tube. It was pressure operated. And this was something that, even when I was an art creative director at the LA Times in the 1980s, I had a couple of my artists that were still using the airbrush, right? And of course, the 1980s was when the Mac started up. So yeah, there was a transformation, but we had that. And Cassandra had that. And it was just coming into vogue back then. So yeah, that's why we're seeing what we're seeing. And interestingly enough, again, flashback to the Cubists. It's like, here's what Braque was doing with his synthetic cubism. That whole subtle suggestion of multiple perspective, that the head could be straight and cocked to the right, there's cubism. Okay, what's being sold here, and how's it being sold? You can see beauty and hygiene, and you could guess that what's going on here is basically a before and after shot. Okay, on the right side, there's this, fairly somber black image that's in need of color and definition. There's everyone has that young, beautiful face that has these elements of balance and symmetry and proportion, geometry, and it can be enhanced by using the good doctor's products. And here we see a very effective use of the airbrush in its softening. Okay, and what do we see also here? We see art. We see the African heads. We see Picasso. We see Modigliani. And this is all part of Cassandra's palette, so to speak. You take a look at his other advertising posters for products such as cigarettes and such. You can see the Bar Cafe. This is in 1932. Everybody by that time was familiar with the 1914 work that Picasso was doing, right? this photo montage. And so here you have just elements. You have Cassandra doing this graceful balance of the track over the lettering. And another one here. You can see the diversity and the range that he has. And what is it? It's futurism, right? And what is futurism? And here we have futurism again. Here's that Nicholas, where the bottles are both swirling and they're also still, these glass bottles. And check out that background. It was one time, and we're going to touch on op art briefly when we get to pop, but I was looking at a post-op painting that's post-op art, not surgically speaking, and I went, damn, 1935, this artist had to have seen this painting because this artist is using the same colors and getting the same effect, and it's actually getting a vibrating effect. And so we'll go to a couple more. We'll wrap up with a couple more Cassandra's works. This one, very important. It's for advertising for a Parisian newspaper, Intransigeant, and it's considered a masterpiece. It's partly because it was the most experimental, and really the most advanced commercial poster of its time. And we touched on Marianne before, symbolic voice of France, and the lettering, the collages of Picasso, Braque, Schwitters, abbreviated words. They didn't need the entire title of the newspaper, right? And we're getting a mobile storytelling device. Here's the information being transmitted over telephone wires, and it's going through Marianne's ear and out her mouth, right? And you can see, you can even see with Schwitters, you can even see the profile happening here. You can see the bits and pieces of letter forms. You can see, again, the stylization of the head with cubism. And I think that, yeah, there it is. And we've got, and why do we have all these things? Movement. Okay, we're seeing ads on trucks for the first time, zooming down the street. And as Cassandra said, today's man's in a hurry. Okay, straight lines. And that's what he was doing. Straight lines. And, you can just imagine the joy that he would have if he had Adobe Illustrator. This is the underlying fabric of his work right here, Intransigeant. And that Marianne looks like she has something circular in her mouth, but it gets strange. But again, looking at the geometry here, you can see this is another lettering design by Cassandra, and there's the internal structure. And sometimes you can take the whole geometry thing really too far, in my estimation, because I look at this particular poster that he did, and I look at the neck of that wine bottle, and I don't think neck of the wine bottle. I think pipes pouring out some kind of fluid into that glass. So for me, especially with all the darkness, it's not that straight. And I know this is not a pipe, but I think that Cassandra may have realized that at one point. And so he went for a profile. And he went for the curving that really gets the feeling of pouring and still being able to maintain his geometry. Okay, last poster that he did. Very famous poster. Very famous. The Intransigeant was most famous in Paris. This was most famous worldwide for Dubonnet. And you look at it, and what is it? It's a comic strip, right? And it's one of the things about it is it's witty. It's another factor in it, and you have elements like, the alcohol has a trademark, and it's this cartoon man whose hat actually repeats the shape of the bottom of his wine glass. And, there's also this color gradation. You can see how he's being filled up. Dubo, doubt. Dubon, good. Look at the way his eyes roll back in his head as he drinks it. And then I do believe I'll have another, pouring another, Dubonnet. So this is telling a story in a similar sort of way that a Calvin and Hobbes might be with any three-panel cartoon, really. But I like this Calvin and Hobbes because it so exemplifies what I hate about most history tests. Here it is. Test. When did the Pilgrims land at Plymouth Rock? Panel 2. 16, panel 3. As you can see, I've memorized the, what is it, totally useless fact long enough to pass the test questions. And I intend to forget it forever. Even you've taught me nothing except how to cynically manipulate the system. Congratulations. Okay? So think of that the next time you're taking a test where you have a teacher whose emphasis is on facts. Okay, in this class, facts don't get you anything, but everything else does. And so that's here we have the pun, and this is a poster that's meant to be seen in action. They were made separately. The Dubon, it's good, and I'm being filled. I'm getting warm. I'm very contented, very, very restful at the end of it. And you can see how his arms serve as an arrow directing you to the bottle, directing you to the pleasure, right? And that kind of stylization. And here it is in context, okay? Multiple postings, okay? You can even see the posters down there at ground level. You can see how you would have 3 posters in a row. And it's one of those things where you see the first one, Dubon, and the second, you walk along and the second one comes along, Dubon, and suddenly you're looking for, because Dubonnet did all kinds of variations on it, you would wait and turn the corner in hopes that you would be able to see the third poster. So this is really interactive in its day, right? In the 20s and 30s. This was people walking down the street and seeing these 3 posters. In this case, the guy's walking in the wrong direction, but oh well, right? And there were subtleties in the posters too that gave them their greatness. So if you didn't want to stop, you get another bonus. Because they could be appreciated by anybody who took the time to study them. So here's the character, the man in the bowler hat. Had a flexible format. It was used in billboards, on subways, writing pads. It worked in different seasons. It worked for Paul Rand in America. Cassandra actually said, this is 1943, he said that it was Paul Rand was the only person in other countries who really was able to maintain the original spirit of the campaign. And yes, I said spirit. And okay, so he was also a font designer, a typeface designer. And you can see, well, actually this one only came in one face. And so, very, very much deco, very much of its time, very much limited in function. It's a display face, right? And it's actually, you see it pop up occasionally, but it's more a novelty font, right? And this is one that was this was popular in the 1970s, Peño, which again is walking the line between display face and text face. And the interesting thing for me about this design is the lower case is more graceful, more modern and innovative, more creative looking, basically, in the uppercase. And that is why it was mostly used. When I say was, because I think the last time I saw Peño in use was on the Mary Tyler Moore show back in the 70s. Okay, and neither Peño nor Byford was commercially successful. And it wound up that Cassandra actually committed suicide in 1968. And much is made of the fact that on Cassandra's desk was a letter from a major foundry informing him that it was halting production of a new typeface that he had designed. Okay, yeah, I know, we're back to suicide, just when we thought we were out of Magritte, right? But it was like, the thing about this, I mean, obviously, nobody should commit suicide for any reason. And to point out a particular in the case of Cassandra, in the kind of work that he was still doing in the 1960s, a couple of years before he killed himself. I mean, look at that Yves Saint Laurent. Look at that beautiful 1963 logo. Look at the space between the letterings. Look at the monogram. My God, how they overlap. Look at the two S's combined, and this wonderful negative space. Look at the interaction. Look at how each E is different. Each N is making something else happen. Each T has a different extension. Okay, how graceful, how gorgeous, how just wonderful the work of A.M. Cassandra is.